Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.
Welcome, listeners. It's time for the Genealogy radio show, the show that's keeping you in the loop with all things with Irish family research. And today's show is about the use of mock and o in Irish surnames and the disappearance and the reappearance and so on. So it's a fascinating story of how we use mock and o in our Irish surnames. I'm using a few sources today. McWilliams, The Surnames of Ireland, is an excellent source for this show, and also other sources that are related to geographical mapping and using the 1890 surname lists to see the distribution of surnames in Ireland. And I will put up the links to these sources with the show tomorrow morning so that people can see where the information comes from. Now, in Ireland, making Irish surnames appear English is something that happens very much around the 16th century, and it's connected to the Tudor Conquest. A source notes that in 1518, the authorities of Gallway decreed, quote, "Neither O nor Mac shall strut and swagger through the streets of the city." The names of the native Irish male population, meaning beginning with O, our mock meaning grandson of or son of, so O means grandson of and mock means son of, meant that that was the personal name of the ancestor. And by outlawing the use of the mock and the O, it meant that the names could be anglicised, and that's really what was required during the Tudor Conquest, because these were seen as barbarous Irish, not loyal to the royal central authority that had come about because of the Tudor Conquest, and it was a way of getting rid of the difficulty of finding out who people were as well, because you could change their name to something simpler, more anglicised, and you would be able to understand it. So it has been well noted under the duress that put the population. There was a lot of famine in 16th century Ireland, and Edmund Spenser, the author of The Fairy Queen, called upon the English, quote, to commit genocide against the Irish. He had lauded earlier works of that of Earl Arthur Grey, who in 1582 used brutal scorched earth tactics. And these type of things, you know, left a resounding memory on the people as well. So maybe people were anxious to anglicise at this time. And it is known that in Clare, for example, by 1609, it was noted by John Davies that the customs and that of the old Brehon were very much melting away, and that the habits and the customs of the Gaelic Irish were diminishing at a high rate. Now, for our types of surnames of our Mac and O's, it's important to refute some of the myths that are around, because some people say that the Mac is Scottish only, and that is not true at all. They both belong in the space of research, and it isn't that mock becomes Scottish and is not Irish. But there is one thing, though, that was noted in this research. The O is rare in Scotland, where it is very common in Ireland to have the O prefix in the names. But surprisingly, through this research, I would have discovered that many of the names that had O attached to them no longer do. And even after the Gaelic Revival, they actually didn't readapt to the use of the O. So some of those are very interesting indeed. For example, Kennedy would have always had an O attached to it, and Connolly, Donnelly, Doyle, Foley, Hogan, Quinn and Sheridan. So we're used to those names as freestanding names. We wouldn't be used to going O Hogan, O Donnelly, O Doyle, O Kennedy. So perhaps our listeners should note that in the sources, though, those O prefixes were more common than not. So when you're looking for your ancestry, you have to be aware of the customs of the time and realise that your surname variant will change the further back you go, and for different reasons. And of course, the Gaelic Irish will come in as well, so the sound of that is very different to what it may sound now in an English form. So the families of the 12th century, the Norman Conquest, had mainly French surnames, and these would be the Darcys, the de Courcys, the Roaches, the Savage, Fitzgerald, Fitzpatrick, Fitzsimon, and many of whom assimilated into Gaelic society. And I think I've made a mistake with the Fitzsimon one, actually, so you may leave that one. And there was the phrase more Irish than the Irish themselves. So did they Burke? What did it change to? De Burr, and so on. So that changed to Burke, and we've had a few mentions of that in previous shows. So surname change. McLysaght notes that on some of the headstones there were 6 different variant spellings on different headstones of the very same surname. McLysaght notes phonetic variations. English officials unfamiliar with the Irish language recorded surnames as they heard them, and they wrote them down as they sounded. For example, McGarrity, MacAroctic became McGarrity, and if you break that down, that's king, Aroctig and so on, and all these type of meanings are very important. So you have the various different spellings of Garrity, Gertie, so on, Garrity, McGarrity. Misspellings was also common as well. And an interesting example was William Shakespeare, who spelled his name in a variety of ways. Despite his great learning and accomplishments, 83 different variants of his name have been attested to in English source material. So this idea that we're not able to spell, or we're too stupid to spell, or something like that, is something that really has to be knocked on the head, especially in relation to all those names linked to Mock and O. We also have substitution, where something is happening with a name, for example, the Clifford name, O'Cluvan, O'Fanachta, so on, Loftus for O'Loughlin, Neville for O'Neill, and where it becomes a lot more fashionable to actually take on a very English sounding name. And in the research for this show, I would have looked at the rules and statutes under Henry V, who brought in the idea of regularising the surname spelling because he wanted to be able to set a poll tax. So surname spelling and surname standardisation and surname registration was not in England prior to that very much. It was very much used as a way to gain tax out of people. And that is significant in itself, because one of the pieces of research would have been that we're always given to mind that we have son of Peter, Peterson. We also had Peter daughter at some short lasting phase, which seems very strange to us in sound. But if your father was John Peter son, or John son of Peter, you could also end up as a Johnson as well, because it didn't differentiate. So there was a short phase there where perhaps you were taking the surname from the first name and then the surname that had gravitated towards it. So it does become standardised in the 1400s period in England, and it's that they want to bring in to a Gaelic conquest in the 1550s and the 1560s. And why do they need to know people's names? Well, they map them by name because they want to know what territories they hold, and they wish to be able to take these clan territories and absorb them. So name change is frequent and occurs often in the 16th century, and it's something that I look a lot at. I look at the eclipsing of the O'Keefes and the mock O'Keefes and the mock Keefes and so on, and where people have been transplanted out of their lands as well. So direct translation is another reason that names change from the O's and the mocks. So you have the O'Markey to Rider, O'Bradon to Salmon and Fisher, Mock-on-Thair to Carpenter or Freeman, Mock-Conroy to King, O'Drochnon, meaning a place abounding in briars. And one of the things I need to research further is the topographic angle to Irish surnames. Some say that there's very little in the idea of place names attached to our mock and O names. But I'm not so sure about that because, for example, the O'Kennedys were actually Kilo'Kennedy. They were from Kilo'Kennedy, from a place. And they got expulsed from that in the 14th century out to Tipperary in Owney and Ara. So Ballymaloney would be a townland as well, and the Irish for Maloney is Voil Downey. So the use of this instead of the mock and O, you bring in the Voil and the Gilla surname in Irish, and that translates out into an English sounding format. So all these things are very fascinating in relation to our mocks and O's. But what happens after the Tudor conquest? Well, we have the Gaelic Revival movement of the 19th century, and it caused many families to reverse the Elizabethan changes. And some families chose to restore the O and the mock to their surnames. Now, I went and I had a look at some surnames in the tithe allotments and in Griffiths because I wanted to see, was this the case? You know, did they really, did large amounts of families adapt their surnames? Well, indeed they did, because in the tithe allotments, for example, you will come across in County Clare many surnames. Connors. O'Connor is quite rare, very rare indeed, but you have actually O'Connors as well. So 81 Connors with the S, you'd rarely find that now. And then later on, that was in 1827, and then in the 1890s, it goes right up that O'Connor is becoming the form, not Connors or O'Connors. The McNamaras, I wasn't surprised to learn that there was no Macs in some of the Namara, and for the tithe allotments there were 64 Namaras. We'd find it very hard to even think about McNamaras today by just calling them Namaras or Nimaras, but I come across that source quite frequently. And the 64, though, were in the tithe allotments, so that's an 1827 source for County Clare. And 49 McNamaras, McNamara, and 7 Macnamara. So you can see it's quite rare enough where you're looking at. Now, some of our, like for example, I looked at the O'Briens as well. So O'Brien, you had Brian, and then you had Brian, Brian as well. So we'd find again it difficult to understand names that didn't have the O with it because we're used to sound and so on. So that's something that you have to get over, especially when you're doing your Irish research. And you'll have to go back historically in time to be able to work out, well, is the O adopted in that case? Is it not adapted to? Is this an Irish-speaking area? And one of the sources I came across would have been Daniel O'Connell, the famous liberator who was responsible for getting Catholic emancipation and so on. But his father was Morgan Connell, and he wouldn't have used the O at all. So again, you can see an O and a disappearance of it in very famous historical figures and so on. Whereas in Irish, the O may have been used in the area that he was from in Kerry. So just some of the things that how did the Irish surnames survive at all? I kind of wondered, really, with the Elizabethan conquest. It must have been very difficult to hold on to them, because by the beginning of the 17th century, it saw the English law and rule prevail, and the Irish laws were outlawed and declared barbarous. Even in the 17th century, I came across on the UCC Celt website, which is absolutely fantastic for various different sources, that, Swift had written a piece about how barbarous sounding the townlands and the surnames were, and how almost impossible it was to pronounce them. So that lasted, that type of idea, and the Brehon laws became very much extinct in many ways. They were laws of great antiquity, and they even predate the coming of the Celts to Ireland. St. Patrick is credited with codifying these laws in the 5th century, and it's quite significant how they're viewed. So the Brehon, or lawgiver, administered the law, and there were various different things needed to make these laws. They were the chief, the poet, the historian, the landowner, the bishop, the professor of literature, the professor of law, a noble, a lay vicar, and so on. So the king himself was bound by law to do justice to his meanest subjects. And how people were seen as equal and unequal is very significant, because that equality could be there amongst all the king and his followers and the petty chiefs and so on, and that would be at odds with this type of separation or isolation that had come in about with the type of system that was in England. So the Brehon law, it's believed, it was based on an individual's identity defined in terms of clan and personal wealth. Honour was evaluated in terms of personal wealth, and each person's wealth or honour price reflected his legal status in the community. So it was important you had the mock and the O, because it was based on 4 generations, and those 4 generations you could be deemed elected as a king or a chieftain, and so on. So our idea of being able to say who we belong to is a very old one. And indeed, surnames in Ireland are older and may well be linked to Brehon law, because they reflect the values of the people. So all these things are quite important. The lowest clansman stood on equal footing in some ways with his chieftain. And as I said, when the several Irish kings visited Richard II in Dublin, the Irish kings sat down to dinner with their minstrels and the entire retinue, as was their custom. So this type of thing was seen as completely at odds in other cultures that were coming in at that time. Now, just to go back to our mocks and our O's, some people may look at the name Smith and think, oh, that is an English surname introduced into Ireland. It may well not be. We have MacGowan, which is O'Gowan in disguise. And Gowan, of course, was Irish for a smith. So that kind of idea that every surname, Smith, is English is not the case. And also, so it's very important you understand the place where your surname is from, and you locate the different places where it may have originated. Clifford, for example, according to MacLysett, are most certainly O'Cluvans in Kerry, but elsewhere they're probably non-Gaelic. So these are significant things that you can't be sure of. You cannot just make assumptions about surnames. Brian Boru's use of the fact that he introduced surnames, MacLysaght would say that is not the case. It did become important to differentiate between people so that you could work out who everybody was, and especially with a conquest coming into the country and so on. So they're all very, very important things indeed. Now, what we have here are some lovely sources as well in MacLysaght's book. So he would look a great deal at how sources, that you look at your various different books and so on for these type. And Wolfe, I'll put the link up, has a great surname source as well. MacLysaght has, and I must draw reference to John Grenham, his Irish ancestry site, which is an excellent resource. I use it because it really shows me, not just in an 1890 mapping sense, where things have changed because it's very post-famine, but around Griffith's valuation, where I can look at the distribution of the mocks and the O's in Ireland by map, and the variants and where the variants lie and so on. So John Grenham's Irish Ancestor site is one that is a must. And of course I must draw reference to, for our mocks and our O's, in the Clare Library website, which easily has one of the best sections of genealogy ever. It's absolutely brilliant. And it does these hotspots of mapping where you can work out the surnames and where they reside in the tithe allotments, then moving through Griffith's valuation, then moving up to 1901 and 1911. And I would love it if they brought in the 1890 distribution mapping as well, because that would complete, you could see the changes. For example, in the 1890 maps that are given as a source for this show today, the problem is the McNamaras are shown in Tipperary in bulk, but they weren't there prior to in the 1500s or the 1600s. So you do have to work out that people move and also have emigrated and so on and migrated and may once have been strong in an area but are moving to another. But it is very significant as to where your mock and your O go and how the surname changes over time, because it can help you find, for example, if someone emigrates belonging to you in 1830 and they spell their name a certain way, it can point out what location they're from when you don't know where they are. If it's more common to call someone Connors, for example, in that particular pocket, it may be a clue as to which place you are looking for. Now, I'm nearly through on the show today, but I just want to make an announcement about a Clans and Surnames event which is being run by my good self in Nina between May the 15th and the 19th in 2017. And you can find the same on the Clans and Surnames website. And it's very much about learning how to research using these tools and also listening to speakers who have greater expertise on space and place and areas, learning about the software, drawing up family trees and having a great week. Also field trips to County Clare, because I couldn't be leaving them out, and so on. So really looking forward to that. And if there's any inquiries, you may contact me through the Genealogy radio show as well. So conclude today, we're looking at the mocks and the O's and what's happening with them. Well, they disappear, they reappear, and the best way you can do is start, even though you may be looking for somebody in the 1820s, to always check the 1901 census, then go back to Griffith's valuation, then go back to the tithe allotments and chart and plot your changes of the mocks and the O's, and realise that it was only the beginning of the mocks and the O's being outlawed in the 16th century. They were again to be outlawed under statutes in the 17th century, but it didn't work. We know plenty of people who still kept using the mocks and the O's, and of course they're back with a vengeance today. So thank you for listening today, folks. And this show will be podcast, and it'll be up live on the website. We put it up through RCB and so on. And tune in, and thank you very much.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family tree.